Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Long Game Podcast with me, one of your hosts, Jason Osborne, and a much prettier Ben Scallon this week. Bev, this is
Thank you, Jason.
obviously a joke. Ben hasn't transed in the same way that I did a couple of episodes ago when he had Fatima in, but Ben is away
I
at the
know
moment.
people will be missing Ben, so I'm sorry, but it's I have to fill in, so someone has to do it.
You'll be an able replacement, I'm sure. Ben is away this week, so yeah, we drafted you, very kindly agreed to be drafted in, Maria.
Yeah, and
Gript
I've never actually done one of the podcasts yet. We were saying this earlier, so it's my first actual podcast. We used to do live streams, but yeah, so I hope it goes well.
Yeah, you're gonna get addicted to them now because it's a way to get away from writing for like an hour and a half, 2 hours during the day. So
It's much more entertaining.
it is. No, it's fun to do, and I'm sure you're going to be an able replacement today, even though, as you say, it's your first one. We have a great audience, thank God, who are very good and supportive. But it's all just to say things are a little different this week. But regardless, we're still going to cover, as we started doing last week or in the past 2 weeks, I can't quite remember. Going to do just a little overview of the topics first, and then we'll dive in and we'll hear what Maria has to say. I'm sure it'll be a more enlightening contribution than Ben or I normally have. So we're going to start off with sort of the most newsy thing of the week, I suppose, which is because it's an absolute news drought at the moment, as they call it, silly season in the industry as well and truly here. So we're going to start with the government plans to revise the not plans they're going to sign off on today, I understand, to revise the National Development Plan, which generally speaking sets out Ireland's infrastructure spending and budget over the next 10 years. So we'll discuss that. We're going to discuss an interview that Maria did last week, a really interesting one, and I'm sure it's one that be a lot of potential for debate around Jennie's law. And you're going to tell us more about that, Maria. It's in relation to essentially a domestic abuse register, a list, I suppose, that people can access in a manner similar to Clare's law in the UK. So we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss, because it's the summer and people are off on their holidays, so why not, Ryanair's admission that they have been giving bonuses to staff who spot oversized luggage, and which yours truly has found himself on the receiving end of this year. So I find myself in the uncomfortable position of acknowledging Ryanair's right to do this while seeing it as a pain in the ass. And then the last thing we wanted to discuss is the internet happening that no one can get away from over the course of the past couple of days. And I was saying to Maria before we went on air that I was asked about this by 3 different people separately of each other over the weekend, the Coldplay concert, and why that has gone viral to a degree that I haven't seen since, I want to say, the Ocean Gate thing, when the billionaires were all stuck in the submersible 2 or 3 years ago now. I can't remember exactly. And yeah, what the special ingredient was that has made this so unbelievably viral. So that's the agenda today. Maria has already assented to it, so I don't need to double check there.
Yeah. And as you said, it is silly season, so we just have to try our best with the topics.
We do. Yeah, we're as constrained as anyone else. So to start us off, as mentioned, I wanted to discuss the probably the most serious of the, well, not the most serious, but one of the most serious of the topics that we wanted to discuss today, which is the government signing off today on a 100 billion revised national development plan. So we can only sort of partially discuss this because the sort of details of the revised plan aren't going to be made available until tomorrow. So that's Tuesday, because this is obviously going out on Monday the 21st. And there's been a national development plan. We've had one for the past 4 years, if I'm remembering correctly. It was 2021 to 2030. And they're, after announcing that they're revising it, and I understand they're revising it sort of in light of the shifting sort of international scene and the threats to Ireland's economy and things like this. And infrastructure has been in the limelight, I would say, over the past, certainly the past couple of months, probably the past couple of years for those who've been following it. Because, just to cite one example, the IMF, they had released a report last month in which they showed that Ireland, I think it was something like, spent 32% less on infrastructure. They invested 32% less in infrastructure than sort of comparable countries. And I think a lot of people living here would be able to tell you that the evidence of that is at hand. The prime example, the thorn in the government side, is the Dublin Metro. They've been talking about that since the early 2000s. It's literally no further along. We've been through multiple
Yeah.
plans, multiple discussions. So it's no further along. So that's all just to say that this is a much scrutinized report, or certainly it should be, because housing, transport, energy, water services, all of those absolutely vital things that have been criticized now for the past while are going to be funded under this new plan. Minister for Public Expenditure, Jack Chambers, said that it'll amount to 100 billion worth of expenditure from 2026 to 2030. And then there'd be another 100 billion in the following 5 years. So it takes us up to 2035. So it's sort of long lasting and, as I say, fairly vital in terms of the things it's supposed to provide for. Don't need to really go too much more into the discussion around it. But
Yeah.
I think Ireland could do with a bit of an infrastructure injection. Maria, I'm sure you probably agree, being at the mercy of it.
100%. And like being from like Northern Ireland, being from the north, you actually do notice the difference when you go over the border, I think, in terms of just certain things where there's just clearly not the funding there that I would say that the north maybe has. I'm not sure. But I think Gript's Matt Tracy, he wrote a really good piece on this back at like the start of 2024, talking about how there was an ESRI report from the Economic Social Research Institute that said that, the huge radical shifts in our population and the societal shifts and the demand that places on things like water and housing and all of these things, that's been really very, very underestimated. And even linked to that, the 2040 plan, that the government have kind of been using almost like fantasy numbers, which has underestimated the whole situation. So it will be interesting to see what we'll obviously learn more tomorrow on it. But I think that, the question is, has the shifts in the population, the huge increased levels of immigration, has that actually made this plan redundant? Because obviously when this was drafted so many years ago, the figures are completely different. And I mean, we've reported this, like the government does have a tendency to just, underestimate the numbers, and they need to be inflated. So it's kind of a question of how realistic it is.
Yeah, I mean, you might say in well, not even in their favor. It would be realistic if they'd get it done in any sort of timely manner. But again, like, to use two of Ireland's greatest sort of how would I put it, thorns in their two of the greatest thorns in the government side, I suppose, have been infrastructure related issues over the past, well, in 5, 6, 7 years in the case of one, and in the past 2 decades in the other. I mentioned one of them a few minutes ago, the metro project. I mean, I was chatting to someone again recently who great knowledge of Ireland's engineering industry. They were speaking about how they were privy to discussions in the early 2000s related to sort of bidding for the contract in relation to the Dublin Metro project. And they were drawing up plans for it even then. And we're no further along now in 2025. I mean, to touch back on what you're saying about how realistic the plans are, whatever about the level of the population, the cost has been greatly affected by these delays. I mean, if I remember correctly, they were projecting the cost of the metro to be about 2 billion euro initially. That has risen to an estimated sort of 25 to 30 billion now, as a result of, inflation and just the ways in which these things change. So the sooner they would get it done, the better. But in the same, as with the housing shortages and housing infrastructure problems, it's the same with transport, the same with healthcare in terms of building hospitals. There's not even discussion really about building prisons, which are obviously in dire need. There's reports today about overcrowding really reaching sort of unbelievable levels in prisons. The obvious solution to that being build more prisons. But the issue are sort of things like labor shortages, because that's been a long-standing issue there. their poor productivity, so not getting the most out of the workers that we have and things like that. And then also just generally planning shortages and sort of poor investment in this area. So it's a fairly toxic mix of things holding up this absolutely vital um
Mm.
the provision of services, I suppose. And this will have an effect because obviously our national economic model, I suppose, is predicated upon attracting foreign direct investment. But I suppose if a lot of this vital infrastructure doesn't manifest over the next couple of years, in relation to water services, because you need those in order to complete buildings and houses and things like that, which are obviously needed for workers, which are obviously needed for industry. It's not going to be good, suffice to say, for Ireland's economic model. So this is one that there's a lot riding on this plan, and there isn't a whole lot of reason to be confident in the government's ability to pull it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when economists have already cautioned about this plan, and when you have the ESRI saying that by its own projections it's underestimated the need for housing,
Mm.
that's obviously a concern, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And as you say,
Yeah.
I mean, the metro is such an essential project. Like the government, another thing about this report is so much will probably be spent on, towards the climate goals. And yet you can tell people, they need to cycle to work, they need to take public transport, and the infrastructure just isn't there. So it's just kind of so nonsensical. And you've got this just virtue signaling all the time that people are perceiving with the the funding for climate policies, and it just doesn't align with actually making the infrastructure feasible. Like if you compare Dublin, I lived in London for a year, and like if you compare it, there's just the public transport is just it's just not there compared to, and we are a European capital, so hopefully that's something that will improve just
Oh,
for people.
I
And
don't know. I haven't double checked it myself, but I think it's true that Dublin is sort of the only European capital that doesn't have a metro system. But even aside from that, this is kind of related to John's rant that went somewhat viral on his podcast last week about how we're great at sort of signaling our intentions and having these grand aspirations. We're not so good at carrying through on the things that people actually need. Because
Mhm.
as you say, of all sorts of great intentions in terms of getting people cycling and all of this, when getting people on public transport and things like this. Anyone who's been living, never mind the rest of the country, where still not getting great service from buses or trains or anything like this. In Dublin, it was just the story of my time in school and university that you'd be waiting for, in some instances, an hour and a half for the bus to come along, because one came along and it was full and it just drove straight past the stop, and then you'd just be standing there. I mean, you can either undertake the 4 hour walk home, or
So grim.
you'd be a bit foolish to do that, because you could walk 45 minutes to the Lewis, but again, that isn't even a very appealing option. So you've got really basic things that you could sort out that other countries, even in their various states of decline and struggle, seem to still be able to provide. As I say, like, a lot of people are very critical of the state of London these days, certainly if social media is anything to go by, and yet they're still able to provide public transport that by and large works. I know that when the Metro link was being discussed at the beginning of this year, I think it was sort of in focus again, because sort of the latest plans around it. There was that line going around, and I understand it to be true, that in the time that Dublin has been discussing a metro, Warsaw has managed to build two fairly extensive metro lines.
It's
And that's a
crazy.
country that only came out of communism, in 1990 or thereabouts. So we really don't have much excuse for not getting this done. You think a government's ability to provide that infrastructure, admittedly, we live in a first world country. We have it pretty good in so many ways. The fact that most of us can shower with hot water most of the time, acknowledging that, these are luxuries. Even still, if you have sort of pretensions to be, a global leader in so many ways as we do, these are sort of the basics you can't afford to neglect. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that. That was just, I felt we should touch on that one, because even though it's probably not the most exciting thing, it's certainly the most significant thing happening today, certainly. And one that's going to have long-term ramifications for Ireland if indeed they're able to, you know, follow through on it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it well there, Jason.
Grand. So, well, we'll skip to one that you're the expert in, I suppose, which is Jennie's Law. You conducted a very interesting interview that our viewers may or may not have seen last week, and we thought it'd be a good one to discuss because it's very interesting and certainly another debate that maybe should have more prominence than it does. But I'd be curious to hear
Yeah.
what you have to say about it.
So last week I interviewed Jason Poole. So his family have it's just such a hard story, and it's one of those stories when you meet him, it's just so hard to believe what they've been through. So his little sister Jennifer, she was 24 years old, and they're from Dublin, from Finglas in Dublin, but was she was killed like in her home by an ex-boyfriend. And she was a victim of domestic abuse, and that was later revealed to the family. They only understood that once the case had gone to court and this all came to light. And it's just a really horrendous case. It happened in April 2021.
Mm.
She was a mother of two small children. You know, just like when you see the photos of her, just a completely normal girl, loved playing camogie, um, you know, very sporty. She had her children very young and had moved into her own accommodation and had done really well for herself, you know. And she had met her boyfriend Gavin, Gavin Murphy, I think is the name. I must check the name, but
I think it is. I think it is.
Gavin
I was
Murphy, isn't
listening
it?
to the
Yeah,
interview
yeah.
before. Yeah, I think so.
So great. So, I mean, it's just a horrible case. He had, you know, a certain level of control over Jennifer, and in the end he stabbed her to death. The details are horrendous, even in court. If you know, I was listening back to the report from the time, and I do remember it being on the news at the time, and just the judge said this is a really, really horrendous case and completely merciless. She had broken up with him and she'd come back to the house. He'd come back to her house and he'd asked, you know, can I be let in for a shower? And what happened was that she was stabbed to death by him, and her family, really, I think her brother, when I met him last week, he was telling me that literally 3 months after her death, they decided, you know, we're going to campaign, we're going to turn this into something, hopefully, like there's hopefully something practical that we can do. And their main concern was that, you know, they had met this guy, they had no idea of his background, of his past. When he'd met her, he had said, you know, he'd been in Spain. That was why he was actually in jail at the time. That, you know, all these kind of excuses and things. And he had a history of violence against women, against a former partner and her mother. And so, like, when I did the interview, the amount of support from women was really interesting. Like, you know, on Instagram, I'd shared it, and loads of friends and people that I knew had, you know, who probably wouldn't normally interact with Gript, had watched the interview and had probably, you know, this is an issue that I think appeals really very much to women. But obviously there's the victims are men as well. So he spoke incredibly well. But this law, I think even Clare's law in the UK, what the law would be, what it would entail would be setting up a domestic violence register. So it would be a system whereby you could go and request information about a partner if you're concerned, or someone can request information on your behalf. If there's certain things where you're just not sure or you're worried about the behaviour, to see if there is a conviction in their past. In the UK, like the law, it's really hardly talked about or hardly known about. There are really not that many requests for information. It's like a right to know, a right to request. So it kind of does go under the radar a bit. But I mean, I've huge sympathy for what Jason is trying to do. And I mean, the government has committed to this law in its approach. Obviously, the argument that some people have is, you know, we don't need more laws. There's also the concern about the right to privacy as well with a register like that. But when you look at the details of the case, it is hard to kind of not, you know, have sympathy for the family, that they argue, you know, if Jennifer had been able to go to the police, go to the guards, and they gave her that information, she wouldn't have stayed with the man who ultimately killed her.
No, it's a really interesting one, and Ben and I sort of said before on this, sort of tricky sometimes to keep on top of all of the content we put out and things like that. So that was very much the case with sort of your interview. I'd only managed to have a look at it earlier today when we decided that we'd speak about it. Naturally, that did set off all of the thoughts in relation to the complexities, I suppose, surrounding the issue, because it seems undeniable, she'd been able to go to the police, I should say, to the police in relation to him, especially if there was sort of a dodgy backstory and things didn't really add up. There's obviously a very good case to be made that she would be alive today, which is obviously the case that her brother is making. I can also see the concerns, I suppose, of those who would resist such a thing on the grounds that, like, well, okay, you might set up a register in relation to people who have a history of, say, domestic violence or violence against women, but would say that's probably not the only indicator of there sort of being a higher propensity or a higher likelihood of carrying out violence against whoever you're living with. I mean, I would imagine, I didn't look at stats before this, but I would have to imagine that if you're embedded in drug crime or something like this and you're, engaged in violent activity regularly, even if you haven't come up in the system before in relation to violence against women, there's a decent chance that you will engage in it in future. That's a fairly poor example, because obviously I'm sure there's lots of people would like to know as well if the person they were after meeting is engaged in, say, violent criminal activity. But I'm sure, I suppose what I'm getting at is there's probably just it's a question of how far do you go. There's probably a load of indicators, I suppose, that might tell that a woman in particular might be in danger with a particular guy. How far do you allow that to go?
I think, and I think you're right, Jason. And like, I think the broader kind of picture with an interview like that is looking at, certain red flags and things, because you just don't know who's out there. Like, I think that's the thing. The law can only go so far. Like, you can't just rely on the system and the state in these kinds of cases. And I think the advocacy is brilliant, but it's also, there's just such a broader discussion to be had about, culture, about, I was even saying to Jason, off air, kind of before the interview, we were talking a bit, and I was mentioning the whole, pornography, that whole aspect of like the violence against women. Like, you hear the most horrendous cases. There was a murder trial in Scotland last week, and it was horrendous. It was, the perpetrator had literally like decapitated his girlfriend, and afterwards he went on his phone and he watched pornography. And that is like, it's so evil and so horrendous. But this is something, when you read court reports about, murders against women, this is one of the things that there is a link to things like pornography. And I think that's worth talking about. I think we leave that out of the conversation, where, we can talk about TUSLA and we can talk about protections that need to be put in place, and, a register. I think it's a good idea in principle, but the conversation is really so much broader than that. And the other thing, I think, when people are talking about, women being killed, because we know from the stats that there are more murders of females in the last, decade, you have to also talk about things like, as they kind of have opened up the conversation in the UK, like with sex crimes and things, and immigration is a factor, like, the nationalities of the perpetrators, like this kind of thing has to be talked about. I think drugs need to be talked about. I think pornography is another factor. So I think it's a huge discussion.
Do you have any sort of sense, because you mentioned a few minutes ago that this legislation, I should say, isn't unprecedented. In the UK, they have what's known as Clare's Law, which is essentially what they're looking for with Jennie's law, Jennifer's Law, which is obviously a sort of domestic violence register that a woman could go to and check whether there's a history of that. Have you any sort of sense as to how that was received or how that works in the UK, whether it's sort of popular legislation or anything like this?
I think because it's not overly, like, it's quite recent legislation. I think a lot of women don't know about it. And it was obviously introduced after a similar case. It was a lady who was killed, and she had gone to the police and requested information about this guy that was stalking her, that she had been with, and they wouldn't give her the information. And so she died in an absolutely horrendous way. And her father then campaigned for this register, for this legislation. And so I'm sure there have been lives saved from that. There are certain concerns in terms of data protection, and people would make the argument, for example, if someone has done something in their past, do they have a right, to keep that information hidden? Like, does someone have the right to request that information, or does the individual have a right to privacy? So that's a question. The other thing with the legislation in the UK that is, I think, really problematic, and the worst thing about it, and it raises questions for this law in Ireland, is that if you go to the police and you're seeking information about someone that you're with, most of the time it's going to be a partner that you're, that's abusing you, and you go to the police to ask for information, you're obviously scared of this person. The police, if they make a disclosure to you, they actually have to inform that the perpetrator that information has been disclosed. So like, that's the worst
No
part of it
boy.
for me. Yeah. So it's like,
Yeah, man,
so
that's
yeah, that's really scary, I think. And I mean, I don't know how you deal with that. It's almost like, if you're going to take away someone's right to privacy, do you not just go the full way and you don't tell them at all? So there's kind of certain contradictions in the legislation, I think. But that was something I found out when I was researching it, that I thought, gosh, like, I'm sure they would probably have to do something similar in Ireland. I'm not sure, but that would, I would assume, stop someone from requesting the information if they think the person's going to find
yeah,
out.
100%. Like, obviously, fear and sort of coercion is such a key part of a lot of this domestic violence. I imagine, yeah, as you say, that if it's a foregone thing that the person's going to be notified that information has been sought or released on them, that would very much put people off seeking it in the first place, and I would imagine sort of go some way towards crippling the usefulness of the bill, or of the legislation, I should say, in the first place. So it's a really interesting one, and I certainly don't just intend to undermine such legislation. I think that transparency culture is a very interesting thing, and it's something that we could do with a great deal more of in Ireland. I mean, myself and Gary Kavanagh discussed it on a previous live stream in relation to freedom of information legislation, that I think that one thing that would go a long way towards transforming Ireland's civil landscape, to name just one area, would be way, way, way greater transparency. We actually must remove in the
Yeah.
opposite direction, would say, to cite the classic example, the closure of benefacts and things like that. So there's harder to track civil and non-governmental organizations and the like. So I do feel that a general shift in the direction of transparency is required. Even chatting to a friend from Sweden a couple of months ago, he was telling me about the almost alien degree of transparency that they have in that culture, where he was saying that they have a sort of public what database, I'm not sure it's the right word, but they essentially have a public right to access certain basic information about pretty much anyone, and the other person, as I understand, won't be notified. So he was telling me, for example, that I think you can find basic information on, say, a person's income and things like this, if you request it. They have that degree of public transparency over there. I'm not necessarily advocating for something like that in Ireland, but I think sort of the spirit of transparency is something Ireland could do with a little bit more of. Certainly, I think there are obviously complexities to this, but I think that there's a sure shortfall of that in Ireland presently. I'm sure there's lots of people who wouldn't necessarily disagree with something like Jennie's law, especially in relation to given that it's sort of a topic that's in focus at the moment, domestic violence. But yeah, it's a tricky one, because there, as Jim O'Callaghan was saying last week in relation to his work as the Justice Minister, there are rights that have to be balanced, and most people
Yeah.
don't like sort of, to be fair to him, I think he's right in that most people don't like to think in terms of having to balance rights. It's always a question of sort of, being absolute about one right at the expense of others and things like that. So it's a tricky one, but certainly an interesting one to cover for you, I would say.
Yeah. And like, I think it's just good. Even he's a teacher, Jason, so Jennifer's brother, and he was kind of, he was talking about these young lads in school who have their their phones, and they have TikTok like maps, and they're able to see, not TikTok maps. I'm such a millennial. I'm such a boomer. But no, the Snapchat maps, so they, can
Oh
track
yeah.
locations. And he said, like, it's actually concerning to see some of the behaviors that he can see these young guys towards their girlfriends, like they have to be checking up on where they are. There's just different things that have emerged, I think, through social media and through the culture. And like, I do think a broader discussion is really useful. Even he said, when his sister was going out with this guy, I asked him, did other people know? Like, did she know him through friends? Did she know his background? And like, there weren't really any mutual connections. And I think even that sounds such a basic thing, but like, it's just so important, the fundamental things. Like, you can easily meet someone and maybe fall for them, and they have a total history that you know nothing about. So it's just kind of, Jason was saying, being aware of those red flags, because that story of his sister, I mean, it's so horrendously sad, and it's like, that's the worst case scenario, but they're just a normal family, and that happened. And they have to go to the graveyard every day, and that, she is no longer with them. And I suppose he says, looking back, there were so many things that were in that relationship that would have been absolute red flags, but you just, obviously hindsight's 100%. So it's like, different things that I found useful, and I think it's a useful discussion. Even, like, I'm in my 20s, like, everyone's still trying to figure things out, and people are in different relationships, and I think it's useful if you've got friends, and just to look out for people and to say something if you think something's wrong. I think that's really important when you look at a case like that. And it's just the human aspect of it it's just so devastating. And I think he's a lovely, lovely person, and they're a lovely family, and they've done great work in terms of getting publicity for this. And I think there are important conversations to be had for both the safety of women and men as well, because the stats show that, we have more reports of domestic abuse, we have more reports of that are being made to the guards in terms of sexual crimes and all of these different things. And I do think things like pornography are also worth talking about, just because you just don't know who you're meeting these days.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, we might, lest we burden
Yes.
viewers too much
Yeah, I
of
know.
a Monday
You cut
afternoon.
a bit of that
We might
out. Yeah.
no, not at all. So we might move on to something, well, probably of less severity, but for a lot of people, very infuriating nonetheless, which was that, well, it's the holiday season, so why not discuss Ryanair and the latest announcement, I suppose, from Michael O'Leary, who I just get great amusement out of him whenever he's in the, I suppose, in the media, because he's so sort of bullish with his unpopular statements and things like that. So the Sunday Times reported over the weekend, they revealed that staff were getting a commission or a bonus on each bag they charged the oversized fee on. And I suppose all these headlines, I'm not going to say they were intended to provoke outrage, but that was certainly the sense you got from these headlines. Naturally, RT had Michael O'Leary on Morning Ireland. I think it was this morning, and he was saying that Ryanair staff are paid 150 per bag to catch oversized bags, and that they're thinking of increasing that commission to eliminate what he called the scourge of passengers with their oversized bags. So I have been on the receiving end of this earlier this year, and I would say I don't know if he said when this came in or if it's been in for a long time, but if I had to take a blind guess, I would say this only came in earlier this year, because as a, relatively impoverished 20-something-year-old, we always fly Ryanair, and so I'm well used to Ryanair and their wily ways at this stage. But earlier this year, so my wife and I have been using the same suitcases like the entire time we've been together, like 5 years or thereabouts. My wife was using one of the suitcases for like a good 5 years before that, because it's an old suitcase, but it's still in fine shape. It's one of those sort of hard shell ones that everyone seems to have these
Yeah.
days. She was using that for, as I say, like 9.5 of those 10 years that she's had it, no problem. I don't think it probably fit into their little sizer. Well, I know it didn't because of what happened. But regardless, it fit into the oversized thing okay. Like, it's nice and compact, didn't take up any extra space or anything like this. We never deprived anyone of space in an overhead locker. I'm supposed to put it that way. And sure enough, we were trying to get onto the plane. When was it? Maybe December last year, actually. It might have been, yeah, towards the end of last year. And the lad that was standing on the desk had popped that into the sizer for me. Sure enough, it was just marginally too big. And he said, okay, €75 fee, and he wouldn't hear anything of it. Now,
That's terrible.
I'm especially infuriated to know that he was lining his pockets with 150.
He was
€1.
profiting off your misery.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's getting a €1.50 cut out of that €75 that I had to hand over to him. And the crazy thing was as well that they wouldn't take card. I mean, it had to be cash, so it would have been a bit of trouble, I suppose, if I hadn't had cash on me.
Where were you going? Was this in the airport?
We were flying
to
this.
yeah.
No, this was in Dublin Airport.
In Dublin,
flying
yeah.
to Poland, as is our usual route. Dublin, Poland, Dublin, Poland. So anyway, he got out of that with heavier pockets, whereas mine were considerably lighter. So it was a massive pain in the ass, especially, just to paint the picture. And I don't mind doing this because I'm going to argue against myself now in a second. I can't remember exactly when this happened. Our son was like 1.5 or something like this. He was crying. He was being difficult. We were burdened with luggage. And this lad had absolutely no problem with saying, yeah, slightly too big, but,
it's just hateful, isn't it?
Yeah, it drove me crazy at the time, and I really, to my shame, wasn't particularly polite about it there and then,
Fair
which
enough.
I obviously regret and shouldn't have been like. But I can say that because I'm going to acknowledge now that it's Ryanair's right to do this. I mean, I feel like we all treat, and I think you're probably going to disagree with me on this. I think certainly when I brought up the topic, you were saying that you disagree with my thinking on it. I'm of the opinion that we live in a world now where we all treat air travel, because we've all grown up with it, as some sort of right, as though like it's merely like it's a sort of government provided service that we have a God-given access to, whereas it's not. It's like it's these companies providing this service that if they didn't provide it, enjoy Ireland for the rest of your life, to put it that way, which I'm not saying is a bad thing necessarily. We're blessed with a beautiful island, but you wouldn't be going anywhere, I suppose, other than my arduous overseas journeys. But it's just to say that, like, if Ryanair says the bag has to be this size, and if you don't do it, you're gonna have to pay a fee, as inconvenient and annoying as it may be, you don't have too much of a leg to stand on, in my opinion. And especially so with Ryanair, where you're not exactly getting gold gilded service for the tickets you're buying.
Yeah, and I think people are really afraid to complain about Ryanair because their social media, it just burns everyone all the time. So no one wants to say anything because they're going to take it and screenshot it and it'll go viral, mocking the customer. But obviously they're very clever with the social media. But yeah, I think this is more of a problem, like, for women. Like, my mum actually said this to me the other day, like, no matter what, I just can never get the bag closed. Like, if I'm going somewhere, like, it's just a personality trait. Like, so I think for women, we are just, like myself, my friends, anytime we're away, it's just multiple suitcases for like a weekend trip. But I think with the pricing and stuff, like, there used to be, I think the era of cheap flights is just over. Like, I remember when I was a student, you could get great deals on flights and things. And I think since COVID, they've really hit people with just making it completely, like, totally unaffordable to go anywhere. So I think even, like, I travel a lot with EasyJet because I go from Belfast quite a lot. And you used to be able to take your little suitcase, like 10 kg on for free. You just got it included. And I mean, long gone are those days. And now they will try and slap a fine on if your bag's like a tiny little bit over the limit. And I just think it's so miserable because, it's really hard to get away without paying for a case these days. So I just think I probably have too many clothes, too much makeup. It just adds to the stress. I'm always that person pulling things out on the floor, trying to get it to fit in. So I will probably be a victim of this new.
You're the sort of person I'd be complaining about in the
airport.
It's like they got the suitcase open. It's like, have they not traveled by plane before? Like,
no, I know, every time. But I mean, yeah, Ryanair, like they just don't care. They just don't care at this stage. So
Well, it's as you say. I mean, I'd be afraid of it. Whereas you might complain about, and I have again to my shame, complained about Aer Lingus on social media before because there was one time that we were stuck on the runway. It was a bit of a joke. We were stuck on the runway for like 3 or 4 hours or something like this. With absolutely, they just kept saying they were doing some examination on the plane, and they kept pushing back the timeline that it would be done by.
yeah,
And I was so aggravated by this because again, we were minding like he was even younger at that stage. He was like a 1 year old, so he was, therefore less reasonable, even if that's possible, less reasonable than a 1.5 year old. Our son was very unhappy by this delay, and naturally that proved stressful for me and my wife. And I decided that's it. I'm going to send a tweet about it,
did
and I
you?
feel fairly safe. Yeah, I naturally got absolutely no traction or anything like this, but I could be fairly safe in doing so without getting a lashing from Aer Lingus. Whereas I feel
Yeah,
like if I had posted about my slightly oversized bag not fitting into the size, or Ryanair would have
they
put me in my place, and I would have been
they would
scrubbed up
have.
on social
They
media.
would have. The attitude is like, you've got your cheap flight. Like, what do you expect? Like, stop. Like, what? Why are you so demanding? But it's
Yeah.
like it all adds up by the time you go. So I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah, like, but again, as I said at the beginning, I have sympathy for that view. It's like
yeah.
they're totally unapologetic about what they're providing you with, and it's like you want to go to Lisbon for a couple of days. It's like, well, you can either play by our rules or enjoy going overseas, or over land, which is gonna take you much longer. So,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
annoying as I find it, I find myself playing by their rules, but it is true what you say about tickets just sort of generally getting more expensive. I mean, I don't know how far in advance you book your tickets or anything like this.
I'm
We're
so last
generally,
minute.
yeah, we're maybe not that bad, but generally like a couple of months in advance. Certainly never like a year in advance or anything like this. But
Yeah.
the thing was, once upon a time, you didn't have to do that in order to get a cheap
No.
flight. Whereas I booked flights to London there 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the cheapest combination of tickets I could get
Yeah.
came to about €390.
It's
I
wild.
think that was for flights in September. Can't remember the exact dates now, but like that is an unreal price for like flights across London. So something has changed, and I'm sure
Yeah, and when I'm at the airport, I always feel so sorry for older people. Like, I just think it's become so inaccessible for, unless you're young and you're on your smartphone and you've got everything downloaded and you know to have your phone charged and you know to have everything. Like, it's quite stressful even when you're tech savvy. Like, we're so tech savvy, people our age, but like when you go to the airport, one of the things I've noticed, there's just no older people anymore. Like, I just think they've made it, it's just the whole digital world, isn't it? Where I just think it's very difficult and very stressful if you're older to go anywhere these days. That's
yeah,
kind of a
no,
side note.
no, you're exactly right. But just because of our time constraints, speaking of
Yep,
older
let's keep
people getting
going.
getting caught out by technology, we might segue to the most viral
They weren't that old,
thing.
Jason. But
Yeah,
yeah.
no, they weren't that old. I would say older people, older than us
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Boomers.
The Now, I didn't even find this particularly interesting, but what I did find interesting was how viral this went. To obviously give the absolute basic context, probably pretty much everyone at this stage has seen the Coldplay concert camera thing where who it's since come to light, the CEO of an American company and his, I believe, HR manager were standing in the crowd. He was standing behind her with his arms around her, looking very much in love. And the concert camera went onto them, and he dropped to the ground, and she turned her back for the entire time the camera was on her, while some girl stood next to them looking thoroughly
So
embarrassed.
bad. Yeah.
And Coldplay's Chris Martin said something like they're either very shy or they're having an affair. Well, the internet got to work, and it turned out it was the latter. They're both married to different people, and they were having an affair. So rather than sort of gratuitously linger on the details of that, as I said, I was particularly interested in the degree of virality this gained because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, three different people mentioned this to me independently of each other over the weekend. As I say, I didn't find it particularly interesting, but I understand why it went so viral. As we were chatting about this morning in our sort of morning meeting, they would have been much better served not reacting when the concert camera went onto them. I suppose they were worried about, the potential that someone in the crowd will recognize them and send the video to either their company or their spouses or whatever it may be. Um, but yeah, I think the difficulty is that he dropped to the ground, she turned away. They are the definition of caught red-handed. So I don't know. I think that was an avoidable mistake on their part, but suffice to say, everyone's seen it now.
So bad. And I think I saw a few tweets and people were saying it's like just the perfect storm. It's a perfect combination of things. You've got Coldplay, and a lot of people they just hate on Coldplay, don't they, for being boring. And then you've got the multimillionaires, the CEO. Like it's the mix of factors. But yeah, I think it's just human nature, isn't it? Like people are just inherently, we can be just cruel, and it's like suffering can just be a bit of a spectator sport. And it's like anything, I think, sometimes where you can point the finger at someone else, you're like, that's not me, that's great, someone else is suffering. Unfortunately, people just love that. And yeah,
I think it is,
it's not
and
great.
it's particularly when it's rich people that we're dealing with. Although, as I said, I don't know exactly how much this lad is worth, but sort of CEO brings with a certain connotations, whether rightly or wrongly. And I know that the last time I can remember something going so viral was that Ocean Gate CEO, the thing where the lads were all stuck in the
Yeah.
submersible searching for the Titanic. That was like a global, or certainly a Western internet phenomenon that everyone was absolutely obsessed with for the few days that it was taking place. So I think that the other thing as well that went really viral on the American internet, which naturally tends to dominate our internet, unfortunately, was when that United Healthcare, if I remember the name correctly, CEO was assassinated by your man Luigi, or allegedly. I don't know if it's been
That's right.
settled in trial, but allegedly by your man Luigi Mangione. And that just prompted a degree of sort of discussion and analysis that I don't remember. So I think whenever there's sort of power or money involved, naturally people are interested in it to a yeah, I would agree, to an unhealthy degree, probably, because these people are sort of in many instances no better or worse than everyone else, but because it's that degree of glamour involved, everyone's fascinated by it.
There's the glamour, you're right, Jason, and then there's also these, you kind of have the perfect targets here in a way. We were talking about this a bit earlier, that you've got the kind of white middle-aged male, and it's just, if it was someone else, you're like, would it have blown up as much as it did? There are plenty of unsavory characters. I think it was just the perfect storm, and I think people, we're kind of quite hypocritical in the sense that we talk so much about open relationships and moral relativism and all these kind of things, and yet people just inherently do not like cheating. They do want people to be held to a certain standard, even though we pretend that we don't, and it's all okay. So yeah, it's
No, I think that's dead right. I think it's the fact that, like, we talk so much about progress and about how much we've changed, and yet something sort of elemental like this will take
yeah,
place. And everyone's absolutely fascinated
the
by
whole
it.
world. Yeah,
As I say, I certainly think the degree that made it so viral was the fact that they didn't help themselves. Like, my God, imagine the camera's already on you and your reaction is
I
to drop to
know.
the ground. Like, literally, it's so embarrassing. So that seems to me the element responsible for the virality of it. But yeah, as I say, I think it's just sort of inherent to us, and it's why a lot of these sort of personal dramas are the things that blow up rather than, say, statistical trends or
Yeah,
anything sort of remotely impersonal, to put it that way. But
it's a
unless you've
human
anything to add,
experience. Yeah,
exactly.
and when something is just meme content, it can be turned into a meme. It can be turned into all the different edits. Like people just do love to have something to laugh about, even though it's not. It shouldn't be funny, and you do feel for the families, but
Yeah, you
it's
do.
just a lesson in human nature, I think.
That's it. Yeah. Don't go to a concert if you're having an affair. No, I jest, and we don't have an affair in the first place. That's a whole
Yes.
different
Yeah.
topic. Um,
Yeah.
but what was I going to say? Yeah, I think that's all we have time for this week. Thank you very much for joining me, Maria, and I'm sure our viewers will be fairly
Thank you,
happy with that.
Jason.
I'm sure they'd be happy to see you back in the future as well. Whenever Ben is gallivanting, as he not
Thanks so much.
infrequently is. So thanks for joining us, and we hope it was an enjoyable episode for all of our faithful listeners, and we'll be back next week. Ben, I imagine, will most likely be back next week with another episode of The Long Game. So until then, God bless.